The walnut-paneled walls of my home office in Vaucluse provided a sanctuary of silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock and the faint, constant hum of the server cooling fans. Outside, the night air was heavy with the salt spray from the Sydney harbor, but inside, my world was governed by the precision of digits and the unyielding weight of contracts. At 8:45 p.m., I sat at my mahogany desk, the desk lamp casting a focused pool of light over a stack of logistics manifests. I was meticulously reconciling the fuel expenditure reports for our fleet currently operating in the remote Pilbara region of Western Australia. For 40 years, I have built this enterprise from a single, rusted flatbed truck into a cornerstone of the nation's civil infrastructure and mining logistics. I do not deal in sentimentality or melodrama. I deal in supply chains, operational efficiency, and the undeniable reality of cause and effect. As I worked, my gaze drifted momentarily to a framed photograph on the corner of my desk, a relic from 30 years ago. It captured a young Lachlan, perhaps 5 years old, sitting on the passenger seat of my original flatbed truck, his small hands gripping the steering wheel while his eyes sparkled with an uncorrupted, infectious enthusiasm. Back then, he would spend hours in the dusty yards, fascinated by the gears and the sheer power of the machinery, listening intently as I explained the value of a hard day's work. There was a time when he understood that everything we possessed was the fruit of sweat, planning, and integrity. Somewhere along the way, that boy was replaced by a stranger, a man blinded by the superficial glare of success and a crippling sense of entitlement that I had, perhaps, been too lenient in allowing to take root. My concentration was interrupted by the sharp, persistent vibration of my smartphone on the polished wood. I set aside my reading glasses, observing the screen. The message was from Lachlan, my 35-year-old son. Earlier that week, he had requested the loan of my vintage set of golf clubs, intending to display them in his home office to impress a prospective corporate client. During a brunch he was hosting on Saturday, I had spent that afternoon carefully polishing the irons, placing the leather bag by the front door, ready to deliver them on my way to attend to some administrative tasks in the city. I unlocked the device. The message read, "Chloe is hosting her influencer brand launch party tonight. Do not come by to drop off the golf clubs. You stress her out. We want peace." I sat back in my leather chair, the leather creaking slightly in the quiet room. I read the words a second time, allowing the cold, calculated dismissal to settle. Chloe, my daughter-in-law, a woman whose professional identity existed primarily within the curated filters of her social media profile, felt empowered to dictate who could enter a property that was, in every legal sense, a corporate asset funded by my own labor. I felt no surge of anger, nor did I reach for the phone to argue. In logistics, when a transport route becomes toxic, you do not plead with the road. You simply terminate the routee. I opened the keypad, ensuring my tone was detached and clinical. I typed "understood." Peace granted. I hit send, placed the phone face down, and returned to the manifests. The silence of the house remained absolute, just as it had been requested. I did not pause to reflect on the coldness of my response. Once the path was clear, I navigated to the encrypted browser window on my primary monitor, inserting my biometric thumb drive to gain access to the master banking terminal of our logistics corporation. The sprawling mansion in the affluent suburb where Lachlan and Chloe resided, a property featuring expansive views of the harbor, was an architectural marvel, but it was also a heavy financial liability. The stark reality of their lifestyle, curated for digital consumption, was entirely sustained by the capital flowing from my legacy infrastructure firm. I navigated to the User Management tab of our Commonwealth Bank corporate facility. With surgical precision, I located the profiles for Lachlan Thorne and Chloe Thorne. Each held a high-limit platinum corporate card, ostensibly for client entertainment and business development. I clicked the Revoke Access button for both accounts. The screen refreshed, confirming that the physical cards currently sitting in their designer wallets were now nothing more than worthless pieces of plastic. They would find their next attempt to pay for an espresso or a luxury retail purchase met with an immediate, silent decline. Next, I moved to the automated clearinghouse directives that manage the home's infrastructure. A property of that magnitude requires a constant, massive influx of capital just to maintain its operational integrity. I accessed the municipal property tax escrow account and the utility grid mandate. I canceled the scheduled quarterly payments, effectively placing their address in immediate arrears with the local council. I then turned my attention to the high-speed gigabit fiber connection, the lifeblood of Chloe's smart home systems and social media performance. Logging directly into the telecommunications provider's administrative portal, I selected the immediate service suspension option due to pending account restructuring. A warning box appeared, advising that restoration would take 48 business hours, a period that would span through their planned Saturday brunch. I confirmed the action without a flicker of hesitation. By 9 p.m., in less than 15 minutes, I had permanently severed the digital umbilical cord that had sustained my son's entire adult existence. I closed the terminal, poured a glass of sparkling water, and calmly returned to my fuel manifests. The house remained silent, the peace they so desperately demanded finally and truly achieved. The sun rose over the harbor on Saturday morning, casting a golden light across my driveway, but the morning air was cold and brittle. At exactly 7 a.m., the heavy brass knocker on my front door began to slam with a frantic, uneven rhythm. I pulled the oak door open, a ceramic mug of black coffee in my right hand, and faced my son. Lachlan looked uncharacteristically disheveled. His custom-tailored silk shirt was wrinkled, and a sheen of nervous sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the early light. Behind him, parked haphazardly in the center of my circular driveway, was a black Porsche Cayenne. It was a fleet transport vehicle, legally registered to my logistics firm, yet he had treated it as his personal grocery getter. The engine was still idling, emitting a low, powerful rumble that disrupted the morning calm. Lachlan did not offer a greeting. He stepped forward, his eyes wide and frantic, invading my personal space with the unchecked entitlement of a man who had never faced a true consequence. "The cards are declining," he blurted out, his voice thin and lacking its usual veneer of authority. "Every single transaction is bouncing. The petrol station, the grocery delivery apps, everything is locked. But that is not even the crisis. Chloe has the catering team setting up at the house right now for her wellness brand launch. They require a $10,000 authorization hold within the next 15 minutes, or they will pull the entire crew, including the champagne towers and the imported ice sculptures. Her investors are arriving in 2 hours. You need to call the bank and lift the fraud lock immediately." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, observing a magpie landing on the edge of my stone fountain. I said nothing, allowing the heavy silence to stretch between us, forcing him to witness the unraveling of his own composure. "Did you hear me?" Lachlan demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "She will be a laughingstock in front of her followers." I lowered the mug, maintaining a posture of total neutrality. I spoke with the measured, steady tone I reserve for negotiating bulk diesel contracts with difficult vendors. "I have been reviewing the household logistics, Lachlan," I said, my voice cutting through his panic. "I have come to the conclusion that financial entanglements are the primary cause of friction in modern family dynamics. Last night, you sent me a very clear request. You stated that my presence was a source of stress and that you required absolute peace. As a father, I have decided to honor that request by removing the source of the friction. The corporate cards are permanently revoked, and the credit facilities have been restructured. I have simply stopped subsidizing an operation that I no longer have a stake in." Lachlan froze, the blood draining from his face as the reality of his predicament finally began to penetrate his wall of entitlement. Lachlan's reaction was not one of reflection, but of blind, impulsive escalation. His mouth opened and closed, his hands trembling as he struggled to process that his father was not an administrative error to be corrected, but a partner who had unilaterally dissolved our arrangement. "You canceled the cards," he whispered, the panic in his eyes sharpening into genuine terror. "You chose this day, the most important day of Chloe's career, to ruin us? Are you mentally sound?" Every cent in our personal accounts is tied to those corporate facilities. You cannot do this over a text message. I did not flinch. I did not ruin you, Lachlan. I replied, my voice devoid of malice, but heavy with finality. I simply ceased to fund you. There is a distinct, measurable difference. If you are a successful entrepreneur, as you have claimed for years, covering a $10,000 catering invoice should be a routine operational expense. I suggest you return home and determine how to finance your own life. Lachlan lunged forward, grabbing the brass handle of the front door, attempting to force his way into my foyer. I know you keep the corporate checks in the wall safe in your study, he shouted, all remnants of social grace abandoning him. I am a partner in the legacy leasing firm. I have a legal right to those funds. I am walking into that study, and you're not going to stop me. His delusion of being a partner was a fiction I had sustained for years, granting him a junior advisory title on a defunct subsidiary solely to bolster his resume for country club memberships. He had never possessed signing authority, but in his desperate, fractured state, he clung to the fabrication as his only lifeline. I stepped forward, physically blocking his path. My decades of overseeing heavy machinery yards had given me a physical solidity that his gym-curated physique could not match. I looked him directly in the eye, my expression hardening into stone. You are a guest on my property, Lachlan, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a warning that even he could not disregard. And your invitation has expired. He recoiled as if struck. He had never seen me look at him with such cold, clinical detachment. I did not raise my voice, but the weight of my presence was an immovable object. I stepped back into the hallway and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The wood closed with a definitive, hollow thud, and the automatic deadbolt engaged with a sharp, metallic click. I stood in the foyer for a moment, listening. Outside, through the sheer curtains, I saw him standing on the porch, staring at the closed door in sheer disbelief, his hands visibly shaking as he reached for his phone to call Chloe. The reality of his predicament had finally begun to pierce through the insulated bubble of his existence. I watched from the safety of my darkened office window as Lachlan paced the front porch, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. After several minutes of frantic, whispered conversation, he shoved his phone into his pocket and moved toward the black Porsche Cayenne still idling in my driveway. He reached into his jacket, and for a moment, I saw the glint of a silver key, the emergency spare I had entrusted to him 5 years ago, intended strictly for medical contingencies. He jammed the metal into the lock of my front door, twisting it with desperate force. He did not know that at 5 a.m., while the neighborhood was still asleep, a private security contractor had methodically repinned every tumbler in my home to a new, proprietary configuration. The key, once a symbol of trust, was now entirely useless. Thwarted and increasingly erratic, Lachlan stomped toward the Porsche. I knew what he was contemplating. 6 months ago, my accountant had discovered a minor discrepancy in the vehicle filing cabinet, a high-resolution color photocopy of the Porsche's title, which Lachlan had clearly duplicated. He intended to drive this fleet vehicle to an unregulated, high-interest lender in an industrial district on the city's outskirts, trade it for quick cash, and race back to save face at the launch party. As he settled into the driver's seat and pressed the start button, the engine remained dead. A red warning light illuminated the dash, and the navigation screen flashed. System locked. I stood in the shadows, holding a small, black plastic fob. In the logistics industry, we do not entrust million-dollar assets to drivers without rigorous telemetry. Every vehicle in my fleet is equipped with military-grade modules that allow for remote diagnostics and, when necessary, engine immobilization. I had triggered the kill switch the moment he exited the car to approach my door. Unable to restart the vehicle, Lachlan sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, a silent scream of rage visible on his face. Eventually, he exited the vehicle, leaving the door hanging wide open, and climbed into an economy rideshare vehicle he had summoned. I did not move to close his car door. I simply sat at my mahogany desk and returned to my fuel manifests. 2 hours later, The silence was broken by the flashing lights of a New South Wales police cruiser. I watched as two officers climbed the walkway. They were investigating a report of a stolen Porsche Cayenne filed by Chloe Thorne. She had concocted a desperate plan. By reporting the vehicle as stolen, she hoped to file an immediate claim with the automotive insurer to secure an emergency payout, hoping to salvage the launch party. It was a transparent, clumsy attempt at insurance fraud. A felony, not a strategy. I opened my door, invited the officers into my study, and prepared to reveal the irrefutable telemetry logs that would effectively dismantle her web of lies. I guided the two police officers into my office, the atmosphere shifting from a routine inquiry to a formal investigation the moment they stepped across the threshold. I did not act with the defensive posturing of a suspect. Instead, I moved with the calm, methodical confidence of a business owner defending his assets. I gestured toward the large dual monitors on my mahogany desk, where the telemetry dashboard for my entire logistics fleet was displayed in real time. There's been a significant misunderstanding regarding the status of that vehicle, I said, my voice steady. It was not stolen. It is a registered corporate asset, and I am the primary authority, governing its movement. I tapped a few keys, bringing up the specific digital footprint of the Porsche Cayenne. A detailed map of Sydney appeared on the screen, overlaid with a precise column of timestamps and geographic coordinates. This vehicle is equipped with military-grade telemetry, I explained, pointing to the log entries. At 7 a.m., the engine was remotely activated at the residence in Vaucluse. It traveled along the arterial routes before arriving here, at my personal address. Furthermore, at 7:15 a.m., I executed a remote engine immobilizer command from this console. The vehicle is exactly where I placed it under my direct control because the operator was no longer authorized to access corporate equipment. The officers exchanged a look of professional surprise as they observed the precision of the data. It was far more granular than anything they encountered in standard civilian theft reports. I then opened the fireproof drawer of my desk and retrieved a thick manila folder labeled corporate transport titles. I placed the original watermarked registration document for the Porsche on the desk squarely between us. This is the original, I stated. Lachlan Thorne has no equity, no signing authority, and no legal ownership of this asset. Chloe Thorne's report of theft is not merely a mistake. It is a fabricated statement regarding property she does not own. I did not stop there. I explained that the suddenness of her report, filed shortly after the corporate accounts were restructured, suggested a calculated attempt to defraud our corporate insurance underwriter. The taller officer, his expression shifting from curiosity to professional concern, reached for his radio. He requested a patch through to the active warrant division, stating that the stolen vehicle report originating from the Vaucluse residence was entirely unsubstantiated. As the officer formally requested that an arrest warrant be drafted for Chloe Thorne on charges of filing a false police report and attempted insurance fraud, I felt no satisfaction, only the cold comfort of order being restored. The trap, built on their own greed and stupidity, had finally snapped shut, and I had merely stood aside to let it happen. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the reality of the situation had intensified significantly. While Chloe remained in custody, Lachlan was left to navigate the wreckage of his life in their cavernous, empty home in Vaucluse. Unbeknownst to me at the time, his desperation had led him to commit a far more severe transgression. Late that night, I was awoken by a piercing, high-priority alert on my secure mobile device. A notification triggered by the artificial intelligence protocol I had installed to monitor our dormant legacy payroll accounts. The report was forensic and undeniable. An unauthorized wire transfer of 60,000 EUD had been initiated from a legacy portal that should have been inactive for years. Lachlan, drawing on credentials he had retained from his short-lived ceremonial role in a defunct subsidiary, had successfully bypassed basic verification layers to move the funds using a digital signature stamp he had illegally duplicated. He had labeled the destination as a legal retainer for a defense attorney, but my protocol, designed to analyze spending patterns against historical vendor contracts, had flagged the routing number as an anomaly. I did not wait until morning to act. I contacted Nolan Foster, my primary corporate proxy attorney, via a secure line at 2:30 a.m. Nolan is a man of singular focus, an architect of legal strategy who protects my empire from hostile takeovers and litigation with a cold, surgical efficiency. I provided him with the timestamp and the routing details. He worked through the night, utilizing his access to interbank clearinghouse data, and called me at dawn with a discovery that turned the situation from a family dispute into a grave criminal crisis. The funds were not headed to a lawyer. They were being routed through a series of shell companies before reaching an offshore holding account registered to Gavin Russo. I recognized the name instantly. Russo is a shadow financier operating on the fringes of the Sydney waterfront, a man known for providing unregulated lines of credit to the desperate and the addicted for illicit high-stakes gambling rings. Lachlan had been using his father's wealth, not just for vanity, but to feed a spiraling gambling habit, and his insolvency had finally alerted Russo that the source of the funds had dried up. Lachlan was not trying to save his wife from the consequences of her own actions. He was attempting to buy his own safety from a man who did not settle debts with lawsuits, but with physical violence. The fraud was no longer just an act of corporate embezzlement. It was an act of raw, pathetic cowardice. Nolan Foster acted with the precision of a seasoned strategist. By mid-morning, he had successfully filed an emergency intercept order with the Executive Fraud Division at the primary clearinghouse, citing corporate embezzlement. The 60,000 AUD transfer was frozen in a federal holding account, effectively vanishing from Lachlan's reach. Meanwhile, back in Vaucluse, the silence of the mansion was shattered. Gavin Russo, having realized that his expected payoff had been intercepted, did not waste time in idle negotiation. He understood that Lachlan was now an insolvent liability. With his two enforcers in tow, Russo arrived at the gated community in a black, armored SUV, showing no regard for the security kiosk. They bypassed the barrier and skidded to a halt on the brick driveway. My home security feed, which I accessed from the logistics yard, provided a bird's-eye view of the confrontation. The men did not knock. The lead enforcer simply kicked the custom mahogany front door, the reinforced hinges yielding with a sickening, splintering sound. I watched as Lachlan, pacing the empty foyer in a state of nervous collapse, jumped back in terror. The three men surrounded him, the shadow financier's attorney opening a leather briefcase to present a property transfer contract. They demanded the 60,000 AUD immediately. When Lachlan stammered that he had no liquid cash, they threatened to seize the Vaucluse estate to settle the debt. Lachlan, desperate to avoid physical harm, rushed to his wall safe and retrieved a thick parchment document, believing it to be the property deed I had given him on his wedding day. He handed it to the attorney, hoping to trade the house for his safety. The attorney scanned the dense legal text, then let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed through the foyer. He tossed the paper at Lachlan's chest, calling him a fool. "This is not a deed," he sneered. "It is a revocable lifetime tenancy agreement. The house was legally owned by an airtight corporate trust that I controlled. Lachlan had absolutely no equity or authority to sell it." Realizing the estate was legally untouchable, Russo turned his attention to the interior. He gave a single, dismissive gesture to his enforcers. They began to strip the mansion with methodical cruelty. They ripped flat-screen televisions from the walls, smashed the frames of expensive art to roll up the canvases, and hauled away every piece of Italian leather furniture. The enforcer who went upstairs returned with Chloe's velvet jewelry boxes, having smashed open her vanity to take every diamond necklace and gold watch she had acquired over the years. Within 30 minutes, they had reduced the illusion of success to bare floorboards and empty rooms. They left Lachlan standing in the hollow box of the foyer, the debt considered settled by the sheer value of the looted luxury goods. The black SUV sped away, leaving the front door hanging off its frame as I sat in my glass-walled office, observing the final, brutal liquidation of a fabricated life. With the mansion in Vaucluse rendered a hollow shell, the final act of my son and daughter-in-law shifted from the physical realm to the digital arena. Chloe, released from custody after her parents scraped together the funds for her bail, returned to the property to find the furniture gone and the foyer scarred by the violence of Russo's debt collection. Faced with the absolute collapse of their lifestyle, they did not choose contrition or the quiet rebuilding of their lives. Instead, they united in a toxic, desperate vengeance. They realized that if they could not claim ownership of the multi-million-dollar estate, they would systematically destroy its reputation and mine to extract capital from the public. They formally notified my proxy attorney, Nolan Foster, of their refusal to pay the maintenance fees required under their tenancy agreement. By doing so, they officially transitioned from authorized residents to hostile squatters, banking on the slow, bureaucratic process of the New South Wales housing courts to grant them months of rent-free shelter. Simultaneously, Chloe turned to the only domain where she still held a shred of perceived influence: social media. She set up a tripod in the center of the stripped, echoing living room. Foregoing her usual, curated aesthetic, she appeared in disheveled clothing, intentionally unkempt to manipulate the emotions of her hundreds of thousands of followers. She broadcasted a masterfully fabricated narrative, sobbing as she claimed that her cruel billionaire father-in-law, had deployed armed thugs to her home to terrorize her and steal her belongings. She painted herself as the innocent female entrepreneur whose wellness brand was being maliciously dismantled by an abusive patriarch. The performance was absurd, yet the internet thrives on the currency of manufactured outrage. She pinned a link to a digital crowdfunding platform at the top of the video, begging for donations to fight my alleged abuse. I sat in my office at the logistics yard, watching the donation counter tick upward: $5, $20, $50, thousands of strangers eager to support a woman currently facing felony fraud charges. Lachlan stood off camera, handing her water, cheering on the monetization of their own public disgrace. I felt no surge of anger, for I am an architect of consequences who understands the psychology of fraud. By allowing the crowd fund to swell past the 200,000 AUD mark, Chloe was not simply defaming my character. She was elevating her criminal culpability. In the realm of financial crime, the severity of the federal penalty is directly proportional to the total monetary value involved in the deception. I watched them build their war chest, knowing that each additional dollar they solicited was merely tightening the noose around their necks. I did not move to silence them. I simply waited for the sum to cross the threshold where the fraud would be categorized as a massive, multi-count federal felony, ensuring that when the hammer finally fell, the impact would be irreversible. The damage to the Vaucluse estate was not confined to the interior aesthetics. Chloe's obsession with expanding her wellness inventory had led to a catastrophic oversight. In her live stream, as she brandished a steel crowbar to pry up the hardwood floors for theatrical effect, the camera angle shifted, revealing the lower hallway leading to the basement. I am a man who builds, and I had memorized the original architectural blueprints for every property in my portfolio. According to the structural plans, there was a critical load-bearing wall separating the hallway from the recreation room, specifically designed to support the weight of the second-floor master suite. That wall was entirely gone, replaced by a cluster of unpermitted, heavy-duty commercial refrigeration units she had installed to store her cosmetic creams. She had hired unlicensed contractors to dismantle a primary structural pillar simply to make room for her vanity inventory, effectively compromising the integrity of the entire mansion. She believed she was safe behind the slow, glacial pace of civil housing court litigation, unaware that she had transitioned from a mere squatter to a public safety hazard. The following morning, at 8 a.m., I did not contact my lawyer. I dialed the direct emergency line for the City of Sydney Zoning and Structural Integrity Commission. I provided my credentials and reported a critical collapse risk at my property, detailing the removal of a load-bearing support without the required engineering permits. The bureaucratic machine of the city moves with a speed that civil courts cannot match. Within the hour, a tactical team of municipal inspectors, flanked by local police, arrived at the gates of the Vaucluse estate. They were armed with an emergency administrative search warrant that overrode all tenant rights. When Lachlan attempted to block the entrance, citing privacy, the lead officer simply moved him aside, noting that the threat of a mass casualty event due to structural failure rendered his objections moot. The inspectors marched straight to the basement, where their high-powered flashlights illuminated the horrifying reality of the situation. The main wooden support joists were sagging by 2 inches, directly above the heavy refrigeration units. The floor above, burdened by the weight of stone bathtub and massive cabinetry, was essentially resting on air. The lead inspector did not waste time with debate. He pulled out a pad of bright neon red stickers and slapped them onto every entrance. Condemned, unfit for human habitation, the signs declared. They were no longer squatters in a luxury home. They were trespassers in a condemned municipal hazard zone. The police officer gave them 10 minutes to vacate the premises with only the belongings they could carry in their hands. As I watched from my office monitor, they scrambled in a blind, pathetic panic through the echoing house, leaving behind the thousands of dollars of inventory they had once thought would make them wealthy. They were escorted to the curb, and as the heavy metal padlocks were snapped onto the gates, I knew the physical foundation of their deception had finally crumbled into dust. Homeless and desperate, Lachlan and Chloe retreated to a cramped roadside motel on the outskirts of the city, the room smelling of damp carpet and industrial cleaning fluid. Yet, even in this state, their arrogance remained intact. They continued to monitor their crowdfunding campaign, which had ballooned past 200,000 AUD, seeing it as their final salvation. They planned to withdraw the funds on Tuesday morning and flee the state, ignoring the warnings from their own fragile logic. While they were busy plotting their escape, I was preparing the final, decisive movement of my operation. I knew that when a man like Lachlan finds himself stripped of digital access and luxury, his mind invariably regresses to the remnants of his childhood. Before I built a national infrastructure empire, I owned a small, unassuming hardware store in an industrial pocket of the city. I had never sold that brick building. It remained a relic of my origins, housing archives and legacy records. Lachlan remembered that in the back office, bolted to the concrete foundation, was a vintage steel safe. In his flawed perception, he believed I was a nostalgic man who had left the security of that vault in the past. He convinced himself that I still stored unregistered bearer bonds or emergency cash inside it, a mythical family treasure that would grant him freedom from Gavin Russo's shadow. At 2 a.m. on Tuesday, I watched on my security feed as Lachlan slipped into the narrow alleyway behind the store. He was no longer the entrepreneur in an Italian silk shirt. He was a common burglar, armed with a jagged piece of concrete he had scavenged from a vacant lot. He smashed the security glass of the service door and crawled inside, his movements shaky and frantic. I watched him navigate the dark aisles, terrified of every shadow, until he reached the rear office. He dropped to his knees, clawed back the rug, and faced the heavy steel door of the vault. He leaned over, his eyes wide with a desperate, feverish anticipation. He remembered the numerical combination, a sequence I had deliberately left unchanged because I needed him to open that door. He spun the brass dial, listened to the mechanical clicks, and pulled the handle. The door swung open, revealing the deep cavity beneath the foundation. He reached his hand into the darkness, expecting salvation, but his fingers brushed only against a small, black plastic square with a single, rhythmic, blinking red light. It was a biometric tripwire, a sophisticated sensor I had installed years ago to protect high-value corporate inventory. By breaking the internal laser plane, Lachlan had not triggered an alarm. He had activated a maximum security lockdown. Instantly, heavy corrugated steel security shutters slammed down over the windows and the service door, sealing the building like a metallic guillotine. The store was flooded with blinding fluorescent light, and I watched through the camera lens as my son scrambled backward, trapped in a reinforced concrete cage of his own making. I pressed the transmission button on my desktop microphone, my voice echoing through the silent store. I built this empire on security, Lachlan, I stated, my voice devoid of warmth. You assumed my silence meant ignorance. You thought you could rob me in the night without consequence. Now, you will finally understand the true cost of your entitlement. I did not need to call the police. The tripwire had already dispatched a Priority 1 burglary alert to the local precinct. The sirens were already wailing in the distance, converging on the store to seal his fate. The sirens reached a deafening crescendo outside the hardware store, a chorus of mechanical screams that signaled the end of my son's long-standing delusion. As the tactical response team breached the steel shutters with diamond-tipped rotary saws, Lachlan did not fight. He remained curled on the dusty floorboards beside the empty safe, his spirit entirely hollowed out by the realization that he had systematically burned every bridge I had ever constructed for his benefit. The officers secured him in restraints, the metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the warehouse, before escorting him out to the waiting patrol cruiser. He was charged with felony commercial burglary, attempted corporate espionage, and destruction of private property, a reality far removed from the lavish, fabricated existence he had projected only days prior. The following morning, I stood in the sterile visitation wing of the county correctional facility. The air was thick with the scent of institutional bleach, a sharp contrast to the refined atmosphere of my home in Vaucluse. Separated by a wall of reinforced bulletproof glass, I watched two guards escort Lachlan into the booth. He was dressed in a bright orange jumpsuit, his hair unkempt, his eyes bruised by deep circles of exhaustion and terror. He reached for the heavy receiver, his hands trembling violently. Through the audio connection, he began to weep, pleading for me to hire Nolan Foster to secure his release, promising he would work in the logistics yard for the rest of his life if I only paid his bail and saved him from the federal charges. I did not move to touch the glass. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I sat perfectly still, observing the man I had supported for 35 years, seeing only the parasite he had chosen to become. "Lachlan," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the emotional warmth he was desperately seeking. "You told me to give you peace. I have honored that contract. My assets are secure, the estate is reclaimed, and my legacy is no longer being drained by your reckless greed." I reminded him that family is a foundation built on integrity, not a limitless bank account for the entitled. When he pressed his palm against the glass, begging me to acknowledge him as his father, I felt no compulsion to respond. I had fulfilled my duty as a parent by providing him with the ultimate gift, the unvarnished, brutal truth of his own character. I placed the receiver back on the metal hook, severing our connection with finality. I walked out of the prison, retrieved my belongings, and stepped into the crisp, clear morning air of Sydney. The surgical eradication was complete. I drove back to my logistics yard, the engine of my empire humming with the reliability of a well-oiled machine. As I watched the sun illuminate the rows of steel shipping containers, a profound sense of clarity took hold. I had learned that true parental love sometimes requires the courage to dismantle a life built on lies to prevent a total collapse of the soul. The ledger was finally balanced, and for the first time in years, the future of my legacy was absolute. I walked toward my office, ready to continue building my life, finally unburdened by the weight of an ungrateful son.